Everybody, welcome back to Discovery. Hopefully you can all hear me fine and see myself and Iris up in the top left. So today Iris is going to talk you through Imagism. So over to you, Iris.
Yeah, cool. Thanks very much, Jack. So I'm Iris. I'm literally about to finish my PhD at Oxford, focusing on kind of 20th century literature. So some of what we're doing today is going to be thinking about 20th century poetry, so poetry in the beginning of the 1900s. I hope everyone can see my screen. If you can't, just wave a hand, but I'm assuming it's working. Okay, so yeah, kind of the principle of today is just wanted to get us to think about. Oh no, hold on. Sorry, yes, wanted us to think about Imagist poetry, and I'm gonna, because of this kind of slightly difficult setup, I want to encourage you to use the chat to jump in as much as possible. So there's going to be some opportunities with kind of speech bubbles.
Iris, sorry, just jump in. Oh. Someone's saying they can't see the slides. I don't know.
Hold on.
Why.
Let me share again.
It might just be one person. Sometimes it's like individuals' computers, but let's find out.
Let me share again. Is that better? Sorry, it's quite hard to see.
I don't know yet. My screen is loading. Let's see. So no one. Yeah, so it doesn't look like it's working yet. Let's give it a second. So I can't see anything now either. If I could see it before.
Okay. I haven't done anything different.
Let me. Maybe I like try. Let me grab the slide. Oh wait, I can see. What can I see? I've got a little bubble for you saying that you're trying to share something.
Oh.
Oh. Let's see.
Oh, it worked a minute ago. That's so frustrating.
Yeah, that is very weird. I have got your slides.
I can try. Let me try one more time and just see. I'll stop and share again.
Sorry, everyone. We will get this working.
Is that any improvement?
Not as yet. Maybe in a second. What I can do is if I share.
Okay.
Let me share mine, and then I think you could take control. I think so. Let's try that.
Okay.
Let me work out how to grab them quickly. Downloads. So my slide's going to come up now. I'll tell you what, that was dead easy. So can people see this? Can anybody see? Cool. So they can see my thing. So Iris, if you
I can.
Cool. So I think you should be able to take control, Iris, somehow. There should be a.
Yes.
Cool. So if you take control and then yeah.
Nice. I can do that. Okay. Perfect.
Happy days.
That's actually easier. Okay, cool. So yes, as I was saying, we're going to talk about Imagist poetry. Because I can't see you guys on video, I'm going to ask you to use the chat to kind of jump in. You'll see there's some bits in bubbles that are kind of activities I'll get you to do or questions that I'll ask. And please, there's no such thing as a wrong answer. We're kind of trying to stretch our thinking about poetic form and its effect. So please do feel free to kind of jump in with any questions or responses, however tenuous you think they are. So I want to start out with a small little exercise. This was one of the poems that I gave you on the kind of pre-activity sheet by William Carlos Williams called The Red Wheelbarrow. And I'll just read it really quickly, very brief. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Actually, this was one I gave you, yeah. So the question I wanted to ask you that I kind of put on the handout was, what is this poem about in a sentence? Can people kind of add in a few words, ideas, phrases? What's this a poem about? Might seem really obvious. Yeah, farm. So kind of drawing us out to think more widely about the setting. Yeah, a red wheelbarrow asserted for us in the title. Interesting. Simplicity. Okay, so thinking more thematically now. Something about life. Yeah, interested in this idea of like kind of drawing outwards to wider themes, analogies maybe. The idea that such a small thing can be so integral, deeper in meaning about the interdependence of man and nature. Yeah, so what's really interesting about the way you guys are looking at it is this kind of there's two layers going on here, right? There's the very factual content. What is this about? Where are we? What kind of objects are we seeing? And then this kind of urge that some of you are having, provoked by my question, to kind of ask the bigger question of aboutness. What kind of theme is happening here? What kind of ideas, if we perceive poetry as needing to reflect on bigger ideas, what kind of ideas are being reflected on here? So that's something to kind of bear in mind, that double layer that it's drawing you to do, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then my second question I put is, do you think this counts as a poem, and why or why not? Quite simply, does this fit your kind of definition of what counts as a poem? And can you give me a couple of words to suggest why? A few of you are saying no. Okay, because it's short. We've got this, yeah, this kind of surprise about maybe the number of words or the number of lines, the length, the kind of detail that we expect from a poem. Okay, yes, it is a piece of writing. It's because it's a piece of writing that expresses a deeper meaning. So you might want to think about how much of that is kind of imposed by a reader versus how much comes from it. Yes, this point about free verse is interesting, right? So one of the points about is it a poem or not, you might think about some quite simple things like, does it rhyme? Is it split into lines of different length? You know, a piece of prose that we see in a novel doesn't tend to look like this. But the fact it's free verse means, yeah, it doesn't have a rhyme scheme. It's kind of moving much more liberally in terms of kind of rhythm and things. Yeah, people are saying it's most structured like a poem. There is attention to diction and imagery, so kind of this sense of precision maybe that makes us think it's a poem. Yeah, okay, really nice ideas. Let's move on, otherwise we'll run out of time. But just some kind of opening questions to get us thinking about what we're counting as a poem and how we're thinking about where the meanings of poems are emerging from. So what we're going to look at, this is just a kind of very brief overview, is the kind of historical background of Imagism, its relationship to what went before, the kind of mood of dissatisfaction that created it, and then the different influences that it drew on. We're going to look specifically at some of the manifestos, like really briefly at what some of the Imagist poets kind of declared they were doing. We'll look at a few quick examples, and then got some little tasks at the end to kind of get us thinking about Imagist poetry. So, picture the scene. At the beginning of the 20th century, Anglophone poetry still felt the legacy of Romantic and Victorian poetry. So, Romantic poetry is what you might, when people are kind of saying, you know, it seems poetic, it thinks about bigger ideas, it's quite kind of deep, as it were. That's what you might be thinking about, is kind of ideas that began to be theorized in Romantic poetry. So, William Wordsworth in 1800 said this: I've said before that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin in emotion recollected in tranquillity. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reaction, the tranquillity gradually disappears, and an emotion, kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation, is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. Now, that's a very complicated sentence, but you can pick out, even without understanding all of it, some of the kind of key phrases that define poetry here. So things like the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And you might want to be thinking in your heads about how that definition of poetry fits with some of the poems you're studying at school. Is there a kind of focus on personal emotion? Is there a focus on this idea of emotion recollected in tranquility? So that kind of seems to contradict this overflow idea, but are poems to do with excess, or are they to do with remembering, recollecting, kind of bringing things together into a form? But this focus here on kind of overflow is what I want to focus on, this idea of excess, the idea of getting to the heart of something. pun intended, which is kind of associated with Romantic poetry. So in the beginning of the 20th century, we had these three key figures, and there were others as well, who began to be kind of dissatisfied with this model of Romantic poetry that was going around. And the three I've put on the screen are some of the kind of big people who established Imagism. We've got Hilda Doolittle, who was known as HD. She lived in London. She kind of moved in the same circles as she actually lived in the same house as Virginia Woolf a little bit earlier than she did. We've got Amy Lowell, who's also a poet, and Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound and HD were lovers for a little bit, so they're all sort of moving in these same circles. Pound was from the US, and then he came to the UK, so he creates this kind of transatlantic collection. And William Carlos Williams, who we just looked at with the Red Wheelbarrow poem, is also an American poet. So this is very much bridging the Atlantic, as it were. And other key figures you might have heard of: Richard Oldington, Ford Madox Ford. I just thought these three had the most kind of sultry portraits to show you here. So these three, as I say, were kind of dissatisfied with the way that Romantic poetry had established this idea of spontaneous overflow, this need to focus on the feeling, this kind of excess, poetic excess, as it were. And while I've presented them here as this kind of trio, and they're a member of a bigger group, they were actually just sort of representing this general mood. And Amy Lowell said something important, which should stay in the background of us thinking about them as a group. She said, "We wish it to be clearly understood that we do not represent an exclusive artistic sect. We publish our work together because of a mutual artistic sympathy, and we propose to bring out our cooperative volume each year for a short term of years," so she was talking about this kind of collection of Imagist poetry, "until we have made a place for ourselves and our principles such as we desire." So this idea that they're not a kind of a group that have named themselves, but they've got this mutual artistic sympathy, this feeling about the way that poetry is going, and they're all kind of leading in the same direction. And that is what has made us as critics kind of impose this category on them and talk about them as the Imagists in the beginning of the 20th century. So that's just something to think about whenever you study a kind of movement in literature, thinking about to what extent it was formed by the people involved in it, or was formed by critics, by us later looking back on it. So they drew on a set of different influences, people like HD and Pound and Amy Lowell. So instead of looking to Romantic poetry, they were very interested in, these are just two examples, in Japanese verse forms and in French symbolism. So Japanese verse forms, particularly the haiku, you will have heard of, the kind of 5-7-5 syllabic form. And this became very big in England in the Victorian period. There was a kind of real obsession with Chinese and Japanese art. You can see on the top right, that's Hokusai's The Wave. People might recognize that kind of woodblock prints from Japan, influenced a lot of these European and English artists, some big names there you can see on the screen. But this kind of obsession with the Orient, as it were, well, as they theorized it. And then also an interest in French symbolism, so both in writing and then also in painting. So that's a picture of Klimt's The Kiss, which again you might recognise. Although later the images would kind of draw away from them, there was this real interest in the way that the symbolists were very precise in their depiction of particular objects standing for other things. So you can begin to see a kind of trend that's going on here, the haiku being something very short, very precise, very countable, and symbolism being something that can be kind of attached, where individual objects or individual elements of the picture can be attached to meaning. We're losing the kind of nebulous overflow bit of Romantic poetry, and we're moving to something a bit more precise. So in March 13, this came out, the Poetry, a magazine of verse, and in it was a kind of a small manifesto, as it were, for Imagism. And one of them was called, there were two small manifestos, and one of them was called A Few Don'ts by an Imagist, which I think is quite an interesting way of formulating your poetry by thinking about what it's not doing rather than what it is doing. So these were some of the rules, and I want to particularly focus on the first two, but I'll read them all to you. So these were written by Ezra Pound and someone else called F.S. Flint. So they say, use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. They say, go in fear of abstractions. Don't retell in mediocre verse what has already been done in good prose. Don't think that any intelligent person is going to be deceived when you try to shirk all the difficulties of the unspeakably difficult art of good prose by chopping your composition into line lengths. Don't be viewy. I really like this adjective. Leave that to the writers of pretty little philosophic essays. Don't be descriptive. Remember that the painter can describe a landscape much better than you can, and that he has to know a deal more about it. And finally, consider the way of the scientists rather than the way of an advertising agent for a new soap. So a little question, and I want you to write your answers to this in the chat. Given these kind of 4 propositions, these don'ts, if you're an Imagist poet, don't do these things, what kind of adjectives would you just use to describe Imagism that you can kind of either that are used directly here or that you can kind of infer from the kinds of things they're saying? How would you describe Imagist poetry just based on this this definition of it? Haunting. Okay, where does that come from? Which one are you inferring from? Yeah, boring. That's interesting. No description, no excess, no superfluity. Restrictive. Yeah. What other kinds of adjectives maybe relating to this idea of kind of restriction? Yeah, sharp and clear. So maybe this is the other side of it being, of perceiving this as boring, being quite precise about what it's doing. Maybe mysterious, although possibly mystery seems to be what they're kind of pushing against, right? This first one, use no adjective which does not reveal something. They're interested in revelation rather than hiding. Yeah, direct, minimal, harsh. Yeah, again, harsh, kind of linking to boring. Maybe that's becoming a more of a the kind of tone that's being implied by these statements. Yeah, intellectual. I mean, even the fact that it's a movement that's being kind of theorized rather than presenting, just write what you feel, that suggests this kind of intellectual commitment. Yeah, sparseness, the sparseness of texture, I like that. Kind of powerful. That's also, you can see that reflected in the very fact of having this manifesto, which asserts what you can and can't do, and particularly what you can't do. There's a real sense in kind of coherence or like the power of what they're trying to do to be sharp. Yeah, so all of these are really good. This idea of thinking about this idea of minimalism, think about the idea of directness, restriction that's going on, containment, and think about how that might relate to poetry that you're reading. And this is kind of 3 other statements that were in the same volume, the same magazine of poetry, under a slightly different heading. They were kind of thinking about different ways to theorize it. And these are the sort of 3 rules written up by Flint. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. So that complicates a little bit what we were saying about the kind of whether there's any emotion contained. So it needs to be direct, but that can be connected to the subjective perception of a thing. To use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. So again, kind of sparse, very careful, very precise, very limiting. And as regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. So that's slightly a different sense of restriction, right? So moving away from the kind of poem's commitment to a rhythm that we might expect and thinking more in terms of natural speech. So that might be surprising, and you might want to consider how that one's working in a more complex way. So both of these kind of manifestos, which I've showed us here, are very interested in the form of these poems, in the appearance of them, qualities like rhythm, the choice of words, the kinds of images that are being depicted. But what I want us to ask today is to kind of add another dimension to this, which is what effect do these short, direct poems have on a reader? And that's what we're gonna kind of run through the few examples that we look at now. How, it's all very well that they set up, we want to write directly, we want to write clearly and sparsely, and in a minimalist way. What effect is it having on the reader? Why do they decide to write poetry in that way? Because as some of you said, it sounds pretty boring and pretty harsh compared to some of the kind of Wordsworth-esque emotions flowing poetry. Okay, so this is the first example. Amy Lowell, a lover. This is the whole poem, confusingly. I'll read it to you. If I could catch the green lantern of the firefly, I could see to write you a letter. So that's my question. What makes this poem Imagist? Can you put some things in the chat? What, given all the definitions we've just come up with, which elements of this poem are Imagist? And try, if you're using adjectives, try and kind of link it to a particular quality of the poem, whether that's a particular use of word or a particular kind of line length or something like that. What do you think? Someone said sharp and clear. Can you connect that to which element, which bit of the poem is sharp and clear? Okay, there is very, oh, it's all coming through gradually. It's to the point and each word contributes to the poem's purpose. Okay, so I guess the sense of like there's no excess around the outside. It creates a new rhythm, making it individual, unique. It gives freedom of subjectivity to the reader. So yeah, it's rhythmical, but not in a kind of fixed metronomic way, right? It doesn't have a kind of iambic pentameter. It seems much more, it flows much more like a piece of prose, I guess, like a piece of speech. Yeah, simple language. I mean, almost all of these words, apart from lantern, firefly, and letter, are monosyllables. That might be something to think about. And every single one of these words, pretty much apart from firefly, is one. You can imagine it being like quite easily translated, right? So this isn't complex vocabulary. This isn't kind of compound words. Very little description. It feels more like a statement or a thought. Yeah, you think I think you'd be surprised if you were given this without a poetic context. You might just think it was a line of speech. Yeah, makes you focus on the line. We'll come back to this. That's a really nice idea, this idea of focus or kind of concentration is the word I'll use later. Lots of meaning in a short phrase and it makes you infer despite the length. Yes, we'll also come back to that, thinking kind of what kind of reading process does it demand from us? But yeah, thinking about all of these things, there's very little description. I mean, you might want to think about the fact that we have no detail about who this I person is. So there's a kind of directness of just getting to the point. We've got this is a kind of conditional clause, isn't it? If I, and when the conditional clause is over, it's finished. There's no kind of expansion. There's no punctuation within it. That could be something to talk about. There's no commas. There's no kind of added clauses, no brackets to add a kind of parentheses. Yeah, so all of these things kind of linking back to this stuff about constraint or directness or kind of to the point, no additional words that are wasting space. So this is another one, extremely short poem by Ezra Pound, and this one's really famous. It's called Ezra Pound in a Station of the Metro. And with this one, you might want to think about how, as with the other one, the kinds of context or information that the title is offering, which in a longer poem you might notice less, but here the title is kind of 1/3 of the length of the whole poem. So Ezra Pound in a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Okay, so the question I want you to answer is actually the second one that just popped up there. And then I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this and kind of write your answers in the chat as you're going along. Where is this poem set? What kind of speaker is there? And what other characters are involved? And I want you to see how much of this you can extract from the poem itself and how much might need a kind of bit of creativity to imagine. So yeah, write your answer. What do you think? Where, what, who? Kind of give me the backstory to this poem. I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, yeah. Start putting your answers in the chat. What kind of scene is going on here? Where are we? Who is there? What's going on? Okay, let's look at a few of these. What kind of scene is going on? So, someone says this idea that's a kind of freeze frame. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get us to think about what's going on in this freeze frame. But you're exactly right. There's no sense, not much sense of movement. Yeah, someone says at a train station where the writer feels dissociated or disconnected from the crowd. Okay, so we're using using the kind of title there to inform this position and thinking about the kind of mood. So maybe the phrase "these faces" is creating a kind of sense of disconnection. They're just blank faces rather than maybe specific people. Viewing people as part of moving nature rather than individuals with their own stories. Yeah, this kind of uh, yeah, kind of lack of individuality, a sea of faces unfamiliar with each with a story, each with a life and hopes and dreams. Yeah, they're focusing on the wet petals on the branch of a tree, a station underground. Yeah, I mean, the difficult thing about this poem, right, is the kind of relationship between that second line and the first line. They seem to belong to quite different poems. And most of you, when you've thought about the setting here, have written about the first line, the station of the metro, and the faces in the crowd. But it's interesting to think about how the second line relates. So you might think of it as a simile, but we don't have the word like, we've just got a colon. So maybe it's a metaphor, but it also invokes, and someone said it right at the beginning, is this a natural scene that we're seeing? Like, which way round is the simile working? Are the petals like faces? Or are the faces like petals? Because we've got only two lines in this poem, it becomes kind of difficult to assert which way round the simile is working or which image is supposed to be the most important. But the point of kind of getting you to imagine the scene now, which kind of worked, is to think about the kind of amount of possibility that's created by a poem this short. So the different relationships between the lines that are evoked, the kind of amount, the difficulty of creating a scene, but the amount of creative work that you have to do to get there. And thinking about whether this poem makes that, like, sort of invites that or makes that easier to do than a longer poem, which maybe sort of appears to give you all of the information and therefore sort of has all the answers and you don't have to do any work to do that. So I want to think that's what I'm kind of thinking about. How does Imagist poetry not only create an effect, but kind of invite this particular kind of reading or readerly creation? So this is the third example I want us to look at. Another one by William Carlos Williams of the Red Wheelbarrow poem. And this one's also super famous, and I really like this one. It's called This Is Just to Say. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. So, I'm going to give you a little bit longer for this, like maybe up to 10 minutes to think about this, and I want you to do it and then copy it into the chat and send it over. Can you write two more stanzas for this poem? Only 4 lines, they only need to be as long as these stanzas you can see here to continue the poem. So imagine that you were drafting this, you'd written the first 3 verses and you wanted to add 2 more and write those 2 more stanzas for me. And think about things like which other details would you add? Which bits of the backstory would you reveal? Would you tell me more about the narrator? How would you develop the scene? Yeah, so I'll give you a few minutes. Think about how you might do that. Yeah, do send them over as you come up with your stanzas. I'll look at them together in the end. Give you a couple more minutes just to type your couple of stanzas into the chat, please. I can read them out. Okay, final call. If you haven't posted your stanzas in the chat, can you do so we can read them out? I'm glad to see some people hyping each other up, but I'd like to see your lines of poetry as well. Okay, let's have a look at a few of these, and please do keep sending them through as you can. This is a good space to try this kind of stuff out. Okay, so one of them, just remember that I was hungry, forgive me. We've got so delicious, yet all I felt was bitter guilt, my hands clutching what was not mine, yet I still felt ecstasy, yet I still felt pride. I think I know I would do it again. Nice. We've got up the rainbow bridge I go of happiness and food, so delicious, so tantalizing. Lots of people using that so sweet, so cold to come back again. I hope they were not too dear to you, for they are gone. May you acquire some more so that we can share them together. Yeah, I don't know if it was deliberate, but I like the lack of question mark kind of mirrors the lack of punctuation we have in the first poem, right? No stanzas, no kind of sense of what part of speech this is. Brought upon a sense of euphoria, like the sun shining down, so bright and so vivid. The joy brought forth dispels the troubled joy, so sweet, so cold. Got a slightly roguer one. My life is like a well, dark, forgotten, and deep. Drip, drip, drip. Their taste, a moment's treasure, lingering on my guilty lips. Okay, so the kinds of things people are coming up with are really nice here. We can see, as I say, that repeated so sweet, so cold. People are sticking to the kind of short lines that are going on. And lots of people's developments are kind of emphasizing, I think, the specific emotions involved in this process. So the one that says, I felt ecstasy, I felt pride, kind of adding on to this the kind of ambiguity we have in forgive me, where we think forgive me is kind of regretful, but it's also immediately moves into this idea of deliciousness. So there's kind of no regret left in there. There's a kind of pleasure that's being done there. Yeah, people kind of doubling down on this idea of I hope they were not dear to you, the apology, the kind of relationship between the you and the I, which is very important in this poem. What kind of relationship is going on here? Who is communicating with who, and why does that matter in the context of these plums? And obviously you might want to think about kind of what's the significance of the way that food is being handled here, maybe as a kind of image for some kind of other relationship. People who've thought about kind of the time of day, so there's obviously breakfast in the poem, but people have thought about the morning, sun shining down, so thinking about whether people are whether this scene is kind of happening because someone's got up earlier than the breakfast person, or whether it's happening kind of late at night in a bit of a feast that's going on behind the scenes. So the point of getting you to do this kind of creative extension is to think about what happens when this poem is longer. What happens when we have more information? So kind of directions that people didn't go down, but I thought you might possibly, is elaborating on who these people are, how they relate to each other, elaborating exactly on the scene of the eating, of the kinds of emotions, which some people did do, the emotions that are involved, and thinking about, does that add to or take away from the poem as it is? So the questions I've asked is, what is the effect of adding these stanzas? And do you think they make the poem more or less effective? So quick answers in the chat. Do you think that knowing more about the context of the plums eating, the relationship between the people, the kind of scene that's going on, does that make the poem more or less effective than the version that Williams has written here? Why? Okay, concise is better. Can you say a bit more why? Ah, okay, leaves more to the imagination. Right, so the idea that the point of these poems maybe is to, as I said, have this kind of create this creative impulse. So the point of it is to kind of spur on activities like this, perhaps. Yeah. What do other people think? Would you prefer it with more stanzas to give us more details, or do you like it short? What do you think? Can people think about what are the possible benefits of having it longer? What kind of details do you find yourself wanting to know that actually might be happening here? Because you can think about things like, right, the short version creates confusion, and maybe that's distracting. Maybe that creates an unpleasant reading experience because you're thinking, I don't know, and that is kind of frustrating or upsetting or distressing in some sense. Whereas the other side of that, as Bethan has said, is maybe this imagination is something that we relish as readers, that we want to be able to do. Any other thoughts? Adding more stanzas reveals more details, makes the poem feel more like a poem that we might expect, but that therefore makes it less in keeping with the laws of Imagist poetry. Okay, so a quite kind of, literal interpretation of that. So it could make the poem, I don't know if it's saying more or less effective, as it could explain further the relationship and effect between the two people. But the short poem has a sense of effectiveness through mystery of what's going to happen. Yeah, it creates mystery of the unanswered question. Right, so we have this kind of double conflict between whether we like not knowing and whether we like knowing. And some of this might come down to kind of personal preference. And some of this, you might want to think about it in the kind of context in which this is being written. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you've got some of these poems being written kind of during the First World War or between the First World War and the Second World War. And you might want to think about the kind of uncertainty that was happening in people's lives at the time, and whether seeing that kind of reflected in poetry might be relieving, might be kind of realistic for them. And this ability to imagine something else might be kind of more realistic or more reasonable or feasible than something that answers all of the questions. So thinking about whether you personally as readers now, but also readers at the time, are kind of craving uncertainty or craving clarity, and how the two are playing out together. And so in Some Imagist Poets, which is the collection that we saw the introduction for by Amy Lowell, where they said, you know, we're not this exclusive group, we've got this mutual desire for poetry. One of the things that she says at the end is, finally, most of us believe that concentration is the very essence of poetry. And I've put on the screen, maybe this seems silly, two different definitions of concentration. So on the left, we have the kind of scientific sense, so concentration in the idea of more particles in the same volume. So concentration in this poetry you might think of as lots of words really close together, and this idea of kind of precision or being really sparing, but sparing in the sense of each word earning its place. Each word is quite weighty with meaning rather than this kind of superfluous, lots of clauses saying the same thing over and over. Each word is very concentrated because it's saying exactly its thing, and it's not got lots of space around it. But then you might want to think about concentration too on the right, and this is more relating maybe to the reading process rather than the writing one. Concentration is the kind of intense focus that you might think about this kind of poetry as creating. So yeah, you might want to think about how that fits with this idea of creativity. So do the poems create a kind of distraction in which your mind is going off into other options, or does it create a concentration because you have to look really closely at the words that are on the page, the kinds of things they're saying? I mean, in the stuff in the chat, people have been saying things about needing to infer, needing to kind of read beyond the words, and that in itself creates a kind of desire to do the sort of stuff you do in Unseen, like a focus on the close reading and unpicking of each word and all of its different possibilities, because you have so few words to work with. So I think that's what I want us to kind of take away from today, is what is the effect of Imagist poetry? And on the one side, we have this kind of impulse, it activates this creative impulse. And on the other side, we have this idea that it causes a concentration, a real focus on the words that are on the page, rather than just kind of going along with the words as they're being depicted, or they're saying the same thing lots of times to kind of reinforce it in our minds. So the final slide then is this slightly silly little vote I want us to do. So I've got two poems, and I want you to I'll read them out, and then I want you to say in the chat, which of these do you think inspires the most readerly concentration and why? And I want you to really focus on the why. Give me a particular line or a particular quality, or describe the way in which the poem you've chosen is creating readerly concentration. So we've got one by HD called Oread. Whirl up sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. I have Amy Lowell, Autumn Haze. Is it a dragonfly or maple leaf that settles softly down upon the water? Okay, just put in the chat, cast your vote. Which one do you think is inspiring the most concentration, and why? What do people think? Can you type in the chat and try to give, well, I need you to give a reason as to why you think it inspires the most concentration. You've got a couple of votes for Autumn Haze. Why? Why does that make you kind of focus or concentrate more? Okay, the vote for Autumn Haze says it brings along more, though in the reader's eyes, it has a question and a mystery. Okay, so yeah, the very fact that it ends in a question mark kind of makes you have to answer it. It makes you think really carefully about what's going on. Yeah. Someone says Oriad because it's more typically poetic and slightly cryptic in a way. There appears to be more deciphering needed. However, it's very likely that there's a hidden meaning behind Autumn Haze too. Okay, so yeah, they both have this kind of cryptic sense. I wonder what creates that in Oriad. Maybe the kind of strangeness of addressing the sea. We've got these imperatives, whirl up sea. That creates a kind of strange conversational dynamic. We're not talking to another human, we're talking to the sea. And yeah, someone else says Oriad much less straightforward than Autumn Haze. So similar, yeah, this idea of maybe the images are more unfamiliar. So pointed pines, great pines, your green is quite vague, whereas dragonfly, maple leaf, water, those are all kind of very vivid images that you can conjure quite easily. Yeah, someone says Oriad, there's more movement to it and more to understand. Yeah, the movement is an interesting thing. In Autumn Haze, we've just got a single question and a kind of softly settling. There's one image or one motion that we're focusing on, whereas in Oriad there seems to be lots of different actions happening one after the other. Whirl, splash, hurl, cover. There's a lot to follow. Yeah, anyone else? What do you think? So Oriad is a kind of HD was quite famous for writing poems influenced by classical scenes or kind of classical mythology. So perhaps there's a kind of intertextual concentration needed there to kind of find out the references that she's making, whereas Autumn Haze is maybe requires less concentration in that sense because it's again a much more familiar picture, a kind of generalized autumn that the reader is going to recognize from their own life in that sense. So yeah, I want the reason for doing this is to think about this kind of to draw back from we've kind of gone to these wider ideas of readerly concentration, the effect of the poem, what's the point of writing short poems, and kind of what does it mean for poetry as we recognize it. But then thinking how we can link that back to the particular forms, the words, the rhyme scheme, the kind of choice of imperative verbs that these poets are using, and how that might create a particular form of concentration. And I think that will draw back to the very first question I asked you about, what are these poems about? Or do they count as poems? What kind of readerly kind of unpicking of the layers do they make you do? And is that kind of concentration, is that particular to these short poems, or do you find that in longer poems, and kind of how is that effect expanded or reduced in the different sides of poem? So yeah, I think that's all we have time for today. Just kind of trying to mess up your sense of what poetry is and how we might conceptualize it and its effects. So yeah, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, but otherwise that's all from me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Iris. Does anyone have any questions for Iris? I've been really, really impressed, I have to say, with some of the comments and the sort of discussion and the way you've all supported each other. It's been really nice to see people sort of like saying, well done, that's really cool. But yeah, has anyone got any questions? You've got a great question there, I think. Iris, I'll let you answer.
How would I define poetry? That's interesting. I mean, I think Probably, I would probably go for this direction of what kind of readerly attention does it demand. You could go for the kind of yeah, the more kind of factual direction of a kind of checklist of forms. But yeah, I would think about, compared to when you're reading a novel, what kind of attention does poetry require? What kind of maneuvers does it make us do? Yeah, interesting question about the origin of Imagist poetry. So yeah, the slide I had that had the haiku in is kind of where these poets found influences in it. There isn't Imagism doesn't exist as a thing before the early 20th century, but there are obviously other versions across different cultures, like an interest in brevity and shortness and this directness. Someone said, "What's your favorite poem?" That's an excellent point. Possibly. Oh, Anne Carson. It's called Falling Lines or something like that. It's about straightening the paper clips and snow falling outside. You'll recognize it. I think it's called The Lines. I'm not entirely sure, but it's by Anne Carson, who's a really interesting poet to look at. Yeah, someone said, what do you interpret as the effect and reason for short poems such as these? I think, yeah, I do. I wasn't making it up. I do think it's to do with highlighting this kind of attention that poetry demands. Oh yeah, it's called Lines. Thanks, thanks, Jack. I was close. Yeah, the kind of attention that poetry requires and kind of getting people to practice those impulses, as it were. And also, I think this was happening in a period of a lot of experimentation within literature. So thinking about kind of messing up and disrupting our assumption of poetry and what poetry looks like, and getting people to ask the very questions I asked you: is this a poem? And if we want to say no, what does that mean about our definition? And if we want to say yes, how does that kind of open up to these possibilities for poetry? So yeah, that's my answer, to kind of disrupt and recreate an experiment with poetry. Yeah, thank you very much, guys.
So I've put in the chat, I've put the link to that poem Lines there, Iris. And that is a really helpful website, I think. If you are interested in poetry, a poem a day on that website is a great thing to just sort of get a feel for the sort of breadth and stuff. I think we are more or less at time, so we'll sort of end things there. Thank you very much, Iris. It's been really interesting, and clearly everyone's really engaged, which seems to be a recurring theme with these sessions, which is really nice to see. Yeah, your next session for this discovery program won't be next week. So next week's half term, so there's no session next week. So the next one is going to be on the 6th of June, and it's going to be on exploring chemistry. So a bit different compared to this, but that's the next one. So, but no, it's not next week, so don't join next week. It's the week after. But yeah, thank you all for your time. Thanks for being so attentive and being so active in the chat. And see you all in 2 weeks' time. Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.